I was just a valet, shoved face first into a gutter in a downpour, when the city's most untouchable socialite saved my life by tossing a check into the filth. It was a check worth 10 of my miserable lives. She didn't even bother to look at me, her indifference so profound she saw me as nothing more than an insect, yet I forged that coldness into armor. For 10 years, every time I had a bone broken, every time I bled out on the docks, or gambled my life on the stock market, I clutched that sweat-stained check to my chest. Even when they called me a classless upstart, I gritted my teeth and kept climbing, all because I swore one day I'd throw her charity back in her face with interest. But when a magnificent Thorn empire finally came crashing down, and she fell from her ivory tower into an underground casino to be auctioned off like property, I was the one who stormed in with a briefcase full of cash. I kicked over the table, grabbed her chin, and whispered, "Miss Sterling, about that tip you gave me? I'm here to pay you back with interest. From now on, I make the rules, because that one act of cold pity in the rain became the only thing I was willing to trade my life for, the woman I wanted back." New York City, and the rain was coming down in sheets. Neon lights bled across the soaked asphalt, spreading like crimson stains. Back then, I was lower than dirt, just another valet at the entrance of the Elysian Club. I just scratched the paint on Carter Thorne's Bentley, and for that, they had me pinned in a gutter on the side of the road, ready to break my legs right then and there. That's when a pale, slender hand emerged from the tinted window of the car and flicked a check into the filthy water. "Let him go," a cool, detached voice commanded. "Consider it a tip." That was Miriam Sterling. She was the most sought-after socialite in the city and Carter Thorne's fiancée. 10 years later, the Thorne family's corporate empire imploded. She was thrown from her untouchable ivory tower and became a beautiful bird in a gilded cage. Her name now, a punchline whispered in back rooms. And me? I'd long since clawed my way to the top over the bodies of other men, trading my blood and sweat for a custom tailored suit and a corner office with my name on the door. In a VIP lounge thick with the scent of whiskey and cigar smoke, I lifted her chin with the tip of my finger. I upended my briefcase, and a river of cash cascaded onto the table. "Miss Sterling," I said, my voice low, "that little tip you gave me all those years ago, I'm here to pay you back with interest. This time, I make the rules. Take care of him." Carter Thorne's voice cut through the downpour, sharp and cold. It held the casual cruelty of a man who never had to get his own hands dirty. Two stone-faced bodyguards slammed my shoulders down, pinning my entire body to the ground, grinding my face into the cold, rough concrete. Mud and rain flooded my mouth, the foul, choking taste nearly drowning me right there. It was 1994, and a summer storm was trying to wash New York City off the map. My name was Edward, and I was nothing more than a valet at the Elysian, Manhattan's most exclusive nightclub. 3 minutes earlier, with the pouring rain blurring everything in sight, I had backed a customer's car into the bumper of a black Bentley. It was barely a scratch. Really, just a hairline fracture on the polished chrome, almost invisible. But to Carter Thorne, the heir to the Thorne fortune, that scratch was worth more than my life. "Mr. Thorne, I'll pay for it," I pleaded, my voice raw as I struggled against the hands that held me like vices. "I swear to God, I'll pay for everything." I knew it was useless. In their world, a poor kid's life was worth less than dirt, while a rich man's car was a sacred object. A gleaming Italian leather shoe came down hard on the back of my hand, grinding my knuckles into the abrasive pavement. I heard a small but sickening crunch as a hot, searing pain shot from my knuckles all the way up my arm. I bit down hard on my lip, swallowing the scream that tried to tear its way out of my throat. A circle of onlookers had gathered under the club's awning to watch the show. Not a single person moved to help. They just watched with smug amusement, laughing at the stupid kid who didn't know his place. "Go on," Carter said, exhaling a plume of smoke with a casual wave of his hand. "Break his legs. Give him a lesson he won't forget." One of the guards raised a heavy iron crowbar. In that split second, I shut my eyes as a wave of despair washed over me, completely submerging me. This was it. This was how my life was going to end. I'd be a cripple for the rest of my days, left to rot in some gutter in this city that eats people alive. "Stop!" A woman's voice, cold and sharp, cut through the noise of the rain and the crowd. The Bentley's rear window slid halfway down. I struggled to lift my head and saw, through the veil of rain and glass, a perfect profile. Her skin was so pale it seemed to glow, but her eyes were cold and distant, like she was watching a brief, uninteresting interruption. It was Miriam Sterling, the sole heiress to the Sterling fortune, the reigning queen of New York high society, and, nominally, Carter Thorne's fiancée. She never once looked at me. She barely spared Carter a glance. A long, pale hand emerged from the window, a flimsy piece of paper held between two fingers. She released it, and the paper was caught by the wind, spinning once in the air before landing in the puddle next to my face. It was a check. The number of zeros on it made my head spin. "That should cover the car," she said, her voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotion. "And his medical expenses." She didn't speak loudly or with any urgency, but the crowbar, raised high in the air, froze instantly. A muscle in Carter's jaw twitched. He forced his menacing scowl into an obsequious smile. "Miriam, sweetheart," he cooed, "this piece of trash isn't worth your money." Miriam still didn't look at him. "It's too loud out here," she said simply. "Let's go." The window slid silently shut, sealing her off from the whole ugly scene, as if in another world entirely. Before he got in, Carter shot me one last vicious look. It was a clear promise that this was not over. He ducked into the car, and the black Bentley tore off into the rain, throwing up a wave of filthy water that drenched me all over again. The bodyguards released their grip, and I collapsed onto the cold, wet pavement, gasping for breath as the rain washed the blood and grime into the street. The satisfied crowd dispersed. Their evening's entertainment concluded. My hand was still trembling, but I managed to fish the check out of the dirty water. The paper was soaked, but the amount written on it was enough to buy a dozen more insignificant lives just like mine. I stared in the direction the Bentley had vanished, able to see nothing but the look in her eyes. It was a bone-deep indifference, the kind you'd show an insect you just stepped on. But it was that cold, careless act of pity that had saved my life. I clenched my fist so hard my nails dug into my palm. The sharp sting of pain kept me lucid, kept me focused. I never cashed that check. I dragged my bruised body back to my shabby, leaking room in Queens, a place no bigger than a shoebox and just as cluttered. I found an old plastic sleeve, the kind for baseball cards, and carefully sealed the check inside. From that day on, I kept it in the inside pocket of my jacket, pressed right against my heart. It was my brand of shame, and it was my only armor. The next day, I quit my job at the Elysian. I went to the docks in Brooklyn. It was the roughest, dirtiest, most chaotic part of the city, but it was also a place where a man could die and be reborn without anyone noticing. I took the heaviest loads, threw myself into the bloodiest fights, and accepted any job that paid. If there was a chance to climb even 1 inch out of the gutter, I grabbed it with both hands and refused to let go. Every time I was so exhausted I thought my heart would give out. Every time I was beaten half to death, I would touch that hard plastic square against my chest. And I would tell myself, "Edward, you can't die. You have to become someone. One day you're going to stand in front of that woman and throw this money right back at her face." I was going to make her see me. Truly, clearly see me for the first time. 3 months later, I saw them on the news. They were at the Plaza Hotel, announcing their ridiculously extravagant engagement party. Miriam was in a long white gown, looking so beautiful she didn't seem real, like an angel who had wandered into the mortal world. Carter Thorne had his arm wrapped around her waist, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. I was holed up in my tiny apartment, eating cold, day-old takeout, scraping the last greasy remnants from a cardboard box. The blue light of the television flickered across my face. Outside my window, the city was a blaze of light, but the darkness in my eyes was deeper than the night itself. "Just wait," I promised myself. "One day, I'm going to tear your whole world down, piece by piece." 3 years flew by like someone had hit the fast-forward button, so fast I barely had time to breathe. New York was a whirlwind. The dot-com bubble was inflating to epic proportions, turning nobodies into millionaires overnight. I was no longer that poor kid from the gutter. Now I was Edward Vance. Every penny I'd earned with my blood and sweat on the docks, I threw it all into the stock market. I didn't know anything about candlestick charts or PE ratios. That stuff was nonsense to me, but I understood people, greed and fear. They were the two most powerful and profitable forces on earth. I wasn't afraid to bet big, and I could afford to lose. But I just kept winning, and with every win, the stakes got higher. My net worth multiplied by 10, and then by 10 again. I started wearing custom suits and slicking my hair back. I learned to tolerate the taste of expensive red wine, even though it felt like I was drinking water. But I knew that to the old money families, I was still just an upstart, a lucky punk who got rich too fast and would never truly have a seat at their table. To them, I was just some lowlife who struck it rich, all money and no class. And I started to follow every piece of news about Miriam Sterling with an almost sick obsession. The society pages painted her as the most envied woman in New York, but I knew the truth was much uglier. For the right price, informants told me all about Carter Thorne's long list of mistresses stashed in hotels, clubs, and apartments all over the city. They said Miriam's life in that gilded thorn cage was no fairy tale. She was like a perfect doll on display in a storefront window, exquisite, beautiful, and completely hollow. One night, I paid a small fortune for a ticket to the charity gala at the Met. I stood on the fringes of the crowd, a glass of champagne in my hand, my eyes scanning past the glittering dresses and jewels, searching for her. She was thinner than I remembered. Her smile was still perfect, a well-practiced expression that stopped at her lips and never reached her eyes. There was a profound exhaustion in her gaze, a weariness so deep that no amount of sleep could ever erase it. A circle of society wives surrounded her, their words dripping with false praise while their eyes shone with unconcealed glee at her situation. Carter was nowhere in sight, probably off with one of his lovers. Halfway through the gala, she excused herself for some air. After a quiet word with the woman beside her, she slipped out a side door onto the terrace. I followed, acting on pure instinct. The wind was strong, whipping a few strands of her usually perfect hair across her face. She stood by the stone balustrade, staring down at the endless river of light that was Fifth Avenue. Her shoulders were shaking with nearly imperceptible tremors. She was crying. The untouchable, unflappable Miriam Sterling was secretly wiping tears from her eyes. I instinctively reached for my pocket, where I always kept a clean, pressed handkerchief. I wanted to go to her, to offer it, to say something, anything at all. But my feet were frozen to the spot. Who was I, after all? Edward Vance, an upstart who got lucky in the market. She was the moon, and the moon doesn't need a hand reaching up from the gutter. I hid in the shadows like a coward, a voyeur. I just stood there, using my body to block the worst of the wind for her. It was a stupid, pointless gesture she would never even know about. After a long while, she composed herself, dried her eyes, and put her perfect, empty smile back on like a mask. Then she turned and walked back into the brightly lit ballroom. She never saw me that night. I went back to my penthouse, a place as cold and sterile as a showroom, and opened my safe. The check, sealed in its yellowed plastic sleeve, was lying right where I left it. I took out a black leather notebook, and on the first page, I wrote, "One day, I will stand beside you." Not as someone looking up from below, not as the recipient of her pity, but as her equal. Maybe even one day, as someone she had to look up to. I started expanding my empire with a frenzy, driven by a hunger that threatened to consume me whole. The easy come, easy go money of the stock market wasn't enough for me anymore. I pushed into real estate, international trade, and then private equity and acquisitions. With every move, I grew colder, more ruthless. Anyone who stood in my way either ended up bankrupt or was cut out of the picture completely. I had to climb higher, and I had to do it faster. I was terrified that by the time I finally earned the right to stand in her light, that light would have already gone out. Another 7 years passed. A recession hit the country like a hurricane, leaving a path of destruction and bankruptcy in its wake. Everything changed that year. The biggest news was the collapse of Sterling Industries. Miriam's father had made a series of catastrophic investments that buried the family under a mountain of debt. The shock sent him straight to the ICU with a massive heart attack, his life hanging by a thread. When the mighty fall, the rats are the first to flee the ship. The first one gone was Carter Thorne. He called a press conference and publicly broke off the engagement. He stood in front of the cameras and spun a web of lies, accusing Miriam of infidelity and claiming the Sterlings had deceived his family about their finances from the start. He washed his hands of the whole affair, leaving Miriam and her family to drown in the filth he created. The news buried them, crushed them under an avalanche of public scorn. I was in the middle of a board meeting when the story broke on the news ticker. I snapped the pen in my hand in two, black ink bleeding through my fingers. "We're done for today," I said, my voice ice cold. I stood up and walked out of the room. From that moment on, I called in every favor I was owed, going through every single contact in my phone. I turned the entire city upside down looking for her. The Sterling family mansion on the Upper East Side was in foreclosure. Her cars, her clothes, her entire life was being cataloged and sold off at auction. It was like she had simply vanished off the face of the earth. 3 days later, one of my men finally got a lead. It was an underground poker club. The place was called the Devil's Den, a notorious hub for high-stakes games and a cesspool for the city's lowlifes. The second I kicked the door in, I was hit by a wall of stale smoke and cheap perfume, a stench so thick it made my stomach turn. And then I saw her, sitting at a table in the back of the room. For one single, horrifying moment, my heart stopped beating. She was wearing a cheap, tight red dress, the kind designed to catch a certain type of man's eye. The slit ran dangerously high up her thigh, revealing a cluster of ugly, purple bruises. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her makeup was smeared across her face. She was surrounded by a group of leering, predatory men, their laughter thick with innuendo as their hands roamed freely over her body. "Go on, Miss Sterling," one of them growled. "Drink up." A bald, sweating man shoved a glass of dark liquor in front of her. "Because if you don't," he sneered, "who's going to pay your daddy's hospital bills?" Miriam just sat there, completely still, her eyes terrifyingly blank. She looked like a broken porcelain doll. Her hand trembled as she reached for the glass. It was the look of utter despair, of a person swallowing their last shred of dignity just to survive. A raw, violent rage exploded in my chest. She was my moon. What right did these animals have to put their filthy hands on her? With a deafening crack, I kicked the door to the private room clean off its hinges. The sudden violence silenced the entire room in an instant. I strode strode forward and snatched the glass from Miriam's hand, smashing it to the floor. The sound of shattering glass was sharp and loud, and liquor and shards sprayed across the already stained carpet. Who the hell touches her? I snarled. The bald man stared at me for a second, then his face contorted with rage. Who the fuck are you? You got a death wish. I didn't waste my breath answering him. I grabbed a heavy glass ashtray off the table and brought it down on his head with a sickening thud. The skin on his scalp split open and blood began to pour. The name's Edward Vance, I said, my eyes sweeping over the other men in the room. They were frozen in place, terrified. Anyone else? The hired muscle in the room started to move, but they were taken down and neutralized by my security team before they'd taken 2 steps. In seconds, the entire casino fell silent, the only sound the whimpering of the bald man on the floor. I turned to Miriam. She was cowering in her chair, her eyes wide with terror, like a cornered animal. She didn't recognize me. In her world, a nobody valet named Edward was less than nothing. To her, I was just another predator, one more dangerous than the last, here to take what he wanted from her. Her body was trembling uncontrollably, her eyes filled with a familiar terror that cut me deeper than any knife. I took off my suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering the cheap dress and the ugly bruises. Come with me, I said, holding out my hand. She didn't move, just bit her lip so hard I was afraid she'd draw blood, her eyes welling with tears. Your father's dead, I told her. I own it now. I made my voice cold and hard, a mask to hide the ache that was threatening to tear my chest apart. From now on, you belong to me. I just had to get her into the car, a black Maybach waiting outside. It was bigger and more luxurious than that Bentley had ever been. The silence inside was suffocating, heavy enough to crush a person. Miriam was huddled in the corner, her knuckles white as she clutched the lapels of my jacket. She kept her head bowed, refusing to meet my eyes. The car moved smoothly through the city streets, but it felt like we were driving straight into the high, impenetrable wall she had built around herself. What do you want from me? She finally asked. Her voice was hoarse, filled with a dead, resigned calm. She was expecting the worst. In her world, the worst was all that was left. After all, what else did she have left to bargain with? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my jacket and pulled out a worn black leather wallet. From a hidden compartment, I carefully removed the check in its plastic sleeve. 10 years pressed against my heart had yellowed the paper and softened its edges, but the elegant signature was still perfectly clear. It was her signature. I held out to her. Miriam stared at the check, her expression a mask of confusion, her eyes darting from the slip of paper to my face and back again. Suddenly, her eyes widened in recognition, a forgotten memory hitting her like a physical blow. A locked door in her mind was thrown open, and she was back in the rain in 1994, looking at a mud-caked valet with hungry, ambitious eyes. She remembered. It was you, she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. The insignificant insect she had casually saved out of pity was now the man who held her entire world in his hands. I reached down and pulled a steel briefcase onto the seat between us. With a sharp click, I unfastened the latches, threw open the lid, and emptied its contents onto the center console. Stacks of $100 bills, bound in paper bands, poured out like a waterfall, forming a small mountain of cash between us. It was a crude, vulgar display of wealth, but it was undeniably powerful. I reached out and took her chin in my hand, forcing her to look at me. Miss Sterling, I said, my thumb stroking her soft skin. I could feel her trembling beneath my touch. That tip you gave me all those years ago, I'm paying you back now with interest. And from now on, I make the rules. The words I had replayed in my head for 10 years finally came out exactly as I had planned. I had imagined this moment for a decade, expected to feel a rush of triumph. I had expected to see shame in her eyes, or regret, or fear. But I saw none of that. I only saw her tears. Fat, silent tears rolled down her cheeks, splashing onto the stacks of money. She wept without making a sound, but each tear felt like a knife twisting slowly in my gut. She didn't beg. She didn't try to bargain. She just looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I couldn't decipher. Was it relief? Or was it a new, deeper level of despair? What are you going to do to me? She asked. I looked at her face. Even broken and bruised at the bottom of a pit, she was still painfully beautiful. I almost said it. I love you. I almost told her I'd waited 10 years for this, for her. But the words were stuck in my throat, a hard, painful lump I couldn't swallow. I was Edward Vance now, a player player on Wall Street, a master of the game. I wasn't that muddy kid being held down in a gutter. I had my pride. More importantly, she had hers, even if it was just the shattered remnants of what it once was. To talk about love now would have been the final, cruelest insult. "You'll be my mistress," I said, the words turning to ash in my mouth. "You'll stay with me until I get tired of you." Miriam closed her eyes, and another tear traced a path down her cheek. "All right," she whispered. She had no choice. I dropped my hand and turned to stare out the window. My reflection in the dark glass was a cold, emotionless mask, but underneath, my hand was shaking. I finally had her. I had her by my side, and I had done it in the cruelest, most desperate way imaginable. The Maybach pulled up to a glass penthouse overlooking Central Park. It was one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in New York City. From the terrace, you could see the entire Manhattan skyline glittering below. I remembered hearing once that it was her favorite view in the world. Back then, all I could do was stand on the street and stare up at these buildings. Now, I owned the view, and I was giving it to her. Miriam walked into the sprawling, empty apartment, her body rigid with tension. Her eyes swept over the marble floors and the minimalist, expensive furniture, but her face was a complete blank. Fear was written all over her face. Fear of the transaction that was about to take place. I pointed to the master suite down the hall. "Go take a shower," I told her. She gave a small, obedient nod, moving like a puppet on a string as she started up the floating staircase. Watching her slender, exhausted, and defeated form, my chest clenched. I picked up my phone and called my personal doctor. "I need you to come by after she's out of the shower," I said. "I need you to check her for injuries. Be discreet." There was a brief pause, and then he agreed. I didn't go near the master bedroom that night. I sat alone in my study in the dark, from dusk until dawn. The ashtray overflowed with cigarette butts, and the air was thick and stale with smoke. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the city lights blink out and then come on again, my mind replaying the last 10 years. Every fight, every gamble, every sleepless night. I had fought my way through the darkness and dragged my moon back with me. But now that I had her, I was afraid to touch her. I was afraid that if I laid a single finger on her, she would shatter into a million pieces. Underneath all this armor I had built for myself, I was still that same kid in the gutter. It turns out that even the most ruthless man in the world is a coward in front of the woman he loves. The next morning, Miriam came downstairs. She was wearing one of my dress shirts. It was far too big for her, hanging off her small frame and making her look even more fragile. The bruises on her arms had been cleaned and bandaged. She had a little more color in her cheeks than she'd had the night before, but she still flinched when she saw me sitting at the table. "Eat," I said, gesturing to the plate of food in front of her. It was a bagel with lox and cream cheese, with a side of fresh fruit. It was the exact breakfast I'd overheard her order in a cafe many years ago. She sat down carefully and picked up her fork. She ate slowly, mechanically, as if she were completing a chore. And as she ate, the tears started to fall again. "What's wrong? Is the food not to your liking?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She quickly shook her head and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mr. Vance," she said quietly. "Thank you." It was the first time she'd ever said my name. After we ate, I took her to the hospital. Her father was still in the ICU. The hospital had already given her an ultimatum: pay his outstanding bills, or they would discontinue treatment. I had the hospital director meet me in the hallway and handed him my Centurion card. "Get in the best doctors," I said. "Fly in specialists from anywhere in the world, whatever it takes. As long as there's a chance he'll wake up, money is no object." The director nodded and bowed, promising to take care of everything. He scurried off to make the arrangements. Miriam stood on the other side of the glass, looking at her father. He was hooked up to a dozen different machines, each one of them keeping him alive. Her shoulders were shaking so hard it looked like she might fall apart. Suddenly, she turned and dropped to her knees in front of me. The sound of her knees hitting the polished marble floor echoed in the silent hallway. "Thank you," she sobbed, her words choked and incoherent as she bowed her head, her forehead nearly touching the ground. "Oh God, thank you." I was frozen for a second, then I dropped to one knee and pulled her back to her feet. She was so light, she felt like she would break in my hands. "Don't you ever kneel to me again," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I looked her right in the eye. "Miriam, you need to understand something," I told her, my voice low and steady. "I'm not here to take advantage of you. I'm here to pay a debt. That check you gave me all those years ago, it saved my life. Now, I'm saving you and your family. After this, we're even." What I really wanted to say was that we could never be even. I wanted to be tied to her for the rest of my life. But looking into her tear-filled eyes, I swallowed the words. One step at a time, Edward, I told myself. You have a lifetime to melt the ice around her heart. Miriam Sterling was not the kind of woman who could be kept. She had been the pride of her family. She had a spine of steel and a fire in her belly that had been buried under an avalanche of pain, but it had never been extinguished. A few days later, she came to me. "I want to work," she said. It was the first time since I'd found her that her eyes were clear and determined. "I don't want your charity," she said. "I'm going to pay you back." My first instinct was to laugh. She couldn't pay me back in 100 lifetimes. But then I remembered the woman she used to be. An award-winning jewelry designer, brilliant and full of life. I couldn't be the one to break her wings for good. "All right," I said, and I gave her a job as the head designer of my company's luxury jewelry division. Vance Co. Jewels was one of the biggest names in the city. Everyone in the office knew who she was. The fallen socialite, the charity case, the mistress who had slept her way into the executive suite. The rumors followed her everywhere. I knew she heard them, the whispers in the break room, the accusations that she was shameless, that she had slept her way to the top. She never said a word in her own defense. She just poured her coffee and walked away. She was stronger than I had ever imagined. She channeled all of her pain, all of her silent rage into her work. She stayed late, sketching for hours, revising and starting over, page after page. I watched her, but I forced myself not to intervene. This was her fight, and she had to win it on her own. The turning point came at the annual industry gala. I took her as my date. She was wearing a black, floor-length gown I'd had made just for her. Around her neck, she wore the first piece she had designed for the company. She was, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman in the room. And that kind of beauty always attracts the wrong kind of attention. Carter Thorne, that bastard, sauntered over with a young, beautiful, and completely vacant-looking model on his arm. He was holding a glass of champagne. Well, if it isn't my dear former fiancée, he sneered, his eyes shamelessly crawling all over Miriam. "You move fast. Didn't take you long to find a new benefactor, did it?" He turned to me. "I have to say, Vance, I never took you for a guy who was into sloppy seconds. Aren't you worried about where she's been?" The crowd around us went silent, all eyes on us, waiting to see what would happen next. The color drained from Miriam's face, and she began to tremble. Her fingers dug into my arm, her nails biting into my skin. I could feel the waves of fear and humiliation rolling off of her. And in that moment, the animal I had kept locked away inside me for 10 years finally broke out of its cage. I gently removed her hand from my arm and took a step forward. I didn't say a word. I just drove my fist straight into Carter Thorne's jaw. There was a sickening crack that you could feel in your teeth. He flew backwards, crashing into a tower of champagne glasses. The whole thing came crashing down, drenching his $1,000 suit in cheap champagne. He landed on his back, choking and sputtering, blood pouring from his mouth. I saw one of his teeth skitter across the floor. The ballroom was dead silent. His model shrieked and scrambled away. Carter staggered to his feet, pointing a bloody finger at me. "You hit me, Vance," he slurred. "Do you have any idea who I am?" I calmly adjusted my cuffs and then slowly, deliberately, let my gaze sweep over the crowd. It was all the warning they needed. Finally, I looked back at his swollen, bloody face. "I don't give a damn who you are," I told him. I turned back to Miriam and wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. "Listen to me, all of you," I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the silent hall. "She is off limits. You touch her, you deal with me. From this moment on, if I hear one word against her from any of you, I will personally guarantee that you never speak again. Do you understand me?" And Carter Thorne, the great Carter Thorne, took a step back. He was terrified by the raw, naked threat in my voice. I gave a short, dismissive snort and led Miriam out of the ballroom. After we had walked for a block, I felt her stop shaking. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw a light I had never seen before. A short time later, Miriam's father took a turn for the worse. The doctors were blunt. He needed a kidney transplant immediately, or he wouldn't make it through the month. But the official transplant list was a mile long. It could be a year or more before a match was found. Miriam was frantic. She spent every night at the hospital, her eyes perpetually bloodshot, until she was nothing but a hollowed-out shell of her former self. Watching her waste away like that ignited a cold rage inside me. I called on every contact I had, legitimate business partners and underworld connections alike. I put the word out on the street, $100 million cash for a viable kidney. No questions asked. For the next few weeks, I barely slept. During the day, I dealt with the endless problems of my legitimate businesses. At night, I waded through the muck of criminals and opportunists. And then, one night, in the middle of a thunderstorm, I got the call. They had found a donor in Thailand. My heart hammered in my chest as I raced back to the penthouse to tell her. I found her curled up on the sofa in the dark, clutching an old photograph of her and her father. Thunder cracked outside, and flashes of lightning lit up the sky. She had always been afraid of thunder. Her body flinched with every clap. I went and sat behind her on the sofa, gently wrapping my arms around her. "I have news," I whispered in her ear. "They found a kidney. Your father's going to be okay." Miriam stared at me for a moment. Then she turned and grabbed the front of my shirt. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Edward, tell me you're not lying." "I'm not lying," I said. "The private jet is already in the air. We can schedule the surgery for tomorrow." A sob broke from her throat, but it wasn't a cry of despair. It was the sound of a person so overcome with relief they finally let go. She threw herself into my arms, burying her face in my chest and holding on for dear life. life, as if I were the only solid thing in her world. I held her close, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the first time she had ever held me like that. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted. We didn't say a word. We just held each other, finding warmth and comfort in the embrace. My shirt was damp, clinging to my skin and outlining the network of old scars that crisscrossed my chest and stomach. They were the medals I'd earned in my 10-year war. Miriam's fingertips lightly traced the long, faded scar near my heart. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "A fight over a piece of turf on the docks," I said. "Does it still hurt?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The look in her eyes in that moment, the sudden tenderness, it stole my breath. "Not anymore," I said. I took her hand and brought it to my lips, kissing her palm. "As long as I was strong enough to protect you," I told her. No amount of pain was too much. I looked into her eyes and I told her everything. I told her about the docks, about the stock market, about the countless nights I spent staring at that check, making promises to a ghost. I told her how I clawed my way out of the gutter, how the thought of one day seeing her again was the only thing that had kept me alive. As I spoke, fresh tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. She finally understood the weight of my obsession, the price I had paid to get here. She raised her hands and gently cradled my face, her eyes softer than I had ever seen them. And then she leaned down and gently, tenderly kissed the scar on my chest. The feeling was like lightning, a jolt that went straight to my soul. It was acceptance and gratitude. It was the moment our story truly began. The surgery the next day was a success. Miriam's father was out of the woods. We stood outside his recovery room, and she looked at me and smiled. It was a real smile, not the practiced, empty one she saved for society events. And in that moment, I knew that the last 10 years had been worth it. Every single second. But our peace didn't last long. The Thorns were old money. They had been wounded, but they were far from dead. Carter made bail, and he was bent on revenge. He conspired with an international money laundering ring to set a trap for me. Soon, my lines of credit were frozen, my lenders called in my loans, and my suppliers were demanding payment in full, blocking the gates to my warehouses. And then, the feds showed up. An anonymous tip had led them to my door with accusations of smuggling and financial crimes. I knew it was Carter. He didn't just want to beat me. He wanted to destroy me. That night, my building was surrounded by a mob of reporters and creditors. I called Miriam into my study and handed her a cashier's check. The number on it was exponentially larger than the one on the check she had given me. "Take this and go," I said, my back to her, my voice flat and cold. "My company is finished. I'm probably going to prison. I can't take care of you anymore." "Go," I said. "Don't let this mess drag you down with me." I had to make her leave. The fight ahead was going to be ugly. I couldn't let her stand in the line of fire. Carter wanted me, not her. If she left, she would be safe. Then I heard a ripping sound. Rip, rip. The priceless cashier's check was being torn to shreds. I whipped around. Miriam stood there, a fire blazing in her eyes. She looked like an enraged lioness. "What in the world do you think you're doing, Edward?" she demanded. "Do you really think I'm the kind of woman who only sticks around when things are easy?" She strode toward me, her chin held high, the very picture of defiance. "Wherever you are, that's my home," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "If you go to prison, I'll wait for you. If you die, I'll be the one to bury you." Her words shattered the cold, hard facade I had so carefully constructed. I lost all control, pulling her into my arms and holding her so tight it felt as if I could absorb her into my very bones. "You foolish woman," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "You're going to regret this." "No," she said, taking a small step back to look me in the eye. "I won't." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small flash drive. "What is that?" I asked, frowning in confusion. "My family may have gone bankrupt," she said, her gaze turning to ice. "But my father was no fool. This contains all the evidence of how the Thorn family has been using my father's shipping company to launder money for the past 5 years. It includes their offshore ledgers. I was saving it as an insurance policy. Now it's our weapon." I stared at the small piece of plastic in her palm, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the silver bullet. With this, Carter Thorn was finished. We started preparing for war. Miriam reached into her old high society network, quietly contacting a handful of influential journalists she knew she could trust. My job was to stall. I had to find a way to keep both Carter and the feds occupied long enough for her to make her move. For those few days, we were like soldiers fighting side by side. Everything that had ever stood between us, our pasts, our scars, our stations in life, it all melted away. The only thing left was a deep, unspoken trust that went bone deep. The night before we made our move, we sat in my dark, empty office, eating instant noodles for dinner. Miriam looked up at me and smiled. "Edward," she said, "if we win this, what's the first thing you're going to do?" I thought for a moment. "I'm going to ask you to marry me," I said, and I meant it. A faint blush crept up her neck as she looked down and took a sip of her soup. "Then you'd better win." Everything went according to plan. The next morning, the story broke. It was everywhere. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, every major news channel. Thorn Empire built on a foundation of crime: money laundering, bribery, and racketeering. The evidence was irrefutable, leaving no room for denial. The city erupted. Federal agents swarmed Thorn Tower downtown. Carter tried to flee the country that night. I was waiting for him at the airport. He saw me from across the terminal, flanked by FBI agents, and his legs gave out from under him. He just collapsed. "Vance, you did this to me," he shrieked, a pathetic, broken man. I looked down at him, just as he had once looked down at me in the pouring rain. "I didn't do anything to you, Carter," I said calmly. "This is just what you deserve." They put him in handcuffs and led him away. He was going to spend a very long time behind bars. The Thorn family assets were frozen and then liquidated in a fire sale where my companies bought up every last piece. I had won. I wasn't just a player on the board anymore. I was the one controlling the game. The most lavish hotel in the city threw a massive party in my honor. Everyone who was anyone was there, all of them waiting to kiss the ring of the new king. But I didn't go. I took off my expensive suit, put on a simple jacket and a pair of jeans, and I drove. I went to the street where the Elysian Club used to be. The building was long gone, replaced by a small, empty park. It was raining. A fine, quiet drizzle, not unlike the rain from 10 years ago. I stood there, staring at the empty lot, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. I had conquered my world, but I had never felt more alone. Suddenly, an umbrella appeared over my head. I turned, and Miriam was standing behind me, holding it over us both. She was wearing a simple trench coat, her hair slightly tousled by the wind. To me, she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. She hadn't gone to the victory party. She had come to find me. "What are you doing hiding out here?" she asked softly. I looked at her, a lump forming in my throat. "I was just wondering," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "if that poor valet from all those years ago, if he were standing here now, would he finally be good enough for you?" It was the question that had haunted me for a decade. Even with all the money and power I had now, whenever I looked at her, I could still feel the cold rain and the grit of the gutter on my face. Miriam smiled. She let go of the umbrella, and it clattered to the pavement. The rain fell on us, instantly soaking our hair and clothes. She stepped into my arms, wrapping her own around my neck and holding me tight. Rain and tears mingled on her cheeks, streaming down her face. "You idiot," she whispered, her face pressed against my chest. "You don't have to be good enough for anyone. The night you saved me in that casino, when you saved my father, the night you held me in the middle of that storm. You've always been my hero, Edward." And in that moment, for the first time, I finally understood what it felt like to have everything. We kissed in the rain, and the money, the power, the empire, none of it mattered. There were only two souls who had finally found their way home. A month later, I bought back the old Sterling family mansion at auction. I hired the original architects to restore it, brick by brick, from the original blueprints. Every last detail was exactly as she remembered. I even had the gardens replanted with the same roses her mother had loved. When I placed the old, heavy iron key in her hand, she cried like a little girl. It was her home again. It was our home. Miriam started designing again. She launched her own bespoke jewelry line and called it Renaissance. Her first collection was called Destiny. The signature piece was a delicate platinum necklace, crafted to look like a rolled-up check and set with a single, flawless diamond. It was an instant sensation. The entire city knew the story behind it. Our story. We were married in the garden of that house. There was no press, no business partners, no high society vultures. It was just the two of us and her father, home from the hospital, smiling from his wheelchair. I stood under an arch of roses in a suit she had helped design. She walked towards me in a simple, elegant white dress. The sunlight caught in her hair, and for a moment, she was so beautiful, she seemed like a dream I had no right to dream. I slid the ring onto her finger, a flawless pink diamond. It had been her mother's. The Thorns had taken it to cover a debt. I had spent a fortune and searched halfway across the world to get it back. I dropped to one knee. "Miriam," I said, my voice shaking, 10 years ago, you gave me a check that saved my life. Today, I'm giving that life back to you, and everything that comes with it. It's all yours." Miriam pulled me to my feet, her fingers lacing through mine. Her eyes were brighter than any star. "Mr. Vance," she said, a small smile playing on her lips, "I'm entrusting you with my entire fortune for the rest of my life. I hope you'll manage it well." After the ceremony, we drove to the top of the Empire State Building. From the observation deck, the city spread out below us, a vast tapestry woven from light and ambition. The wind was cool, carrying the faint sound of a distant siren. I took a check from my pocket. It was a new one. I had signed my entire personal fortune over to her. I pressed it into her palm. This time, I said, tapping the tip of her nose, "I'm the one giving the tip, and the terms are for life." Miriam glanced down at the check, then back up at me. She burst out laughing, and the sound was brighter than all the city lights at our feet. "So, you're still the one who makes the rules?" she teased. I pulled her into my arms and kissed her. "No," I murmured against her lips. "From now on, my wife makes the rules." The night was soft, and the future was ours. The young valet who couldn't even lift his head in the rain finally had his moon. And this time, she would never fall. In the end, it all came came back to where it started, a check. But between the first one, a mark of shame tossed into a gutter, and the last, a promise of a lifetime, lay a decade paved with blood and tears. It was the story of one man's climb and the mutual salvation of two souls who found each other at the edge of the abyss. This story was never a simple tale of revenge or a powerful man's obsession. At its heart, it's about being seen and finding one's worth. In the beginning, Edward's worth was defined by a worthless check, his very existence invisible. That cold indifference became his armor. He swore he would make the world, and more importantly, make her see him. He would do it in the most brutal, primitive way he knew how, by throwing his value, measured in money and power, right back in her face. But when he finally had the power to make the rules, he discovered that true strength wasn't about forcing someone to submit to your will. It was about finding them at their most broken and using your strength to build a new world for them. It was about gently telling them, from now on, we make the rules together. This is the journey from conquest to protection, the mark of a man whose soul has gone from poverty to true wealth. Perhaps there's a lesson in that for all of us. At some point in our lives, we all receive a check of our own. It might be a crushing failure, a dismissive comment, a moment of profound misunderstanding, or even an unexpected kindness that leaves us feeling indebted. The question is, what do we do with it? Do we let it be the thing that breaks us, or do we forge it into armor, into the fuel that drives us through the darkness? What gets us through the long, dark nights? Is it hate? Is it love? Is it a stubborn refusal to be defined by others? This story suggests they might all be two sides of the same coin. Hate gives us the power to tear through the darkness, and pride makes us climb. But in the end, the only thing that can bring us peace at the summit is love. It teaches us that the ultimate victory isn't conquering the world, but standing beside the one person who truly sees you, ready to face whatever comes next together. May we all find that fire within ourselves, the one strong enough to burn through any hardship. May we learn to turn every debt we are handed into an opportunity to make things even. And then we might discover that true growth isn't about proving ourselves to the world. It's about learning how to protect what matters most, that small, sacred part of our own hearts, and the one person we've allowed to live there.